Greetings. I'm Steve Shields, author of Divergent Paths of the Restoration, published by Signature Books in 2021, the fifth edition. I thought it might be interesting for some to hear a little bit about the story of how the book came to be, which is about a 45-year long history, maybe closer to 50. I was a senior in high school, and I took early morning LDS seminary in the small Utah town where I grew up. The teachers felt the early morning students deserved to work harder than the daytime students. So over the course of 4 years of high school, I had to write term papers for a year. My senior year class was church history, and so based on some information that I'd picked up at the Kirtland Temple during a family trip a few years earlier, I wrote a paper about the history and beliefs of what was then known as the RLDS Church, now Community of Christ. One of my classmates had been to Independence. I had never been there. And he told me the story of another church that claimed to have been founded by Joseph Smith, which is the Church of Christ Temple Lot. So I began looking into that organization, and the next term paper was on the Church of Christ Temple Lot. Didn't want to leave out everybody, so I rounded it out in the third term with a paper on the LDS Church. And somewhere in the course of all of that, I came across a listing by the late Russell Rich, professor of religion at Brigham Young University. He had listed about 50 different organizations that traced their beginnings to Joseph Smith, Jr. So at the end of my senior year, I published a small booklet with the 4 term papers in it. It was printed locally by a small printing press. Fellow teacher, actually a teacher in my high school who taught graphic arts. He helped me print a few dozen copies. I was off to BYU in the fall of 1974, and I couldn't get the Divergent Paths out of my mind, and so I spent all of my free time particularly on Saturdays, in the special collections section of the Harold B. Lee Library. They had an extensive holding of newsletters, tracts, books that covered many other of the churches of the movement. In the spring of '75, the first edition of Divergent Paths of the Restoration was published while I was at BYU. Not a large collection. I think I had maybe 100 or so listed in the book. In the summer of '75, a second edition was issued with some expanded information. 1982 was the first, I'll call it a real book. It was hardbound, properly typeset, printed several thousand copies from Bountiful, Utah. I did that all under my own small business that I'd set up called Restoration Research. In 1990, I issued a 4th edition and had about 180, I call them expressions of the movement, listed in there. And that was eventually picked up by Herald Publishing House in Independence, and that edition stayed in print for another almost 15 years, I would guess. It was reprinted several times. But over the past 16 or so years, I began working through about 18 boxes of accumulated documents. Each box was what we call a banker's box. It's the size of half size of a file, long file drawer perhaps, and realized I needed to update the writing. I needed to try to be more objective, make it not necessarily apologetic or anti anybody or anyone, anything. And so in August of 2021, Signature Books published what we now call the 5th edition. It was done as an ebook, which took a bit to get my head wrapped around because I'm sort of an old school book person. I love books. I love the smell of ink on paper. Although with modern day book printing, they're not using the old style ink, I suppose. This is my first ebook. Its price makes it accessible to most, if not all. The challenge is that I can't sign copies for anybody. I can't have a book signing party or things like that. Booksellers can't pick up copies and sell them retail. But basically, if we had gone with a print edition at over 1,000 pages, it would have made for probably a book too thick to be done in a proper binding and stay together. May have had to go to 2 volumes. From a marketing standpoint, 2 volumes is kind of a no-sell for most. The price would make it prohibitive for a lot of people. And updating would be a lot harder to do because we'd have to issue a new edition. With an ebook, along the way, we can, at least in theory, update information. Inevitably, I will have in the 5th edition some misunderstandings that I had and have reported things in perhaps an awkward way that may need to be fixed. There's always going to be new groups coming along, new expressions of the movement coming along, if you will. And with an ebook, we can respond to those sorts of challenges much more quickly and keep moving forward that way. However, after 50 years of working in the field, and I'm reaching my later middle age years, if I can call it that, a younger generation needs to pick up the baton and move forward. I think. I hope we can find someone who will have the same passion that I've had. I would like to have a printed copy. I have to admit that. But as far as I know, the publisher has no plans to do that. I suppose if enough people agreed to spend a couple $100 for a printed copy, they might consider a special edition, but you'll have to talk to Signature Books. I don't have any control over that. I'm happy to get the information out there in the hands of researchers. This lifelong journey of dealing with the divergent paths of the work that Joseph Smith got started in the 1820s has been very interesting. I've met dozens upon dozens of prophets and apostles and other interesting folks. All have different perspectives, all have different passions about what is right or correct. And I think reveling in the diversity of the movement is a rather interesting approach to take, rather than one particular focus as the rubric and everybody else being wrong. So that's what I wanted to share. I hope you will take a look at the book, buy a copy, and enjoy some of the fascinating stories that I've enjoyed over most of my life. Thanks again.